the social and political and economic kind of day-to-day lives of people here in medieval Europe. And so our topic is going to be feudalism and the manor system, and we'll talk about how those work themselves out in this European sphere at this point after the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of medievalism. We're going to pull out one of these guys to use as a case study. This is going to be Charlemagne, Carl the Great. So we're going to use the French pronunciation. It's a little more famous, Carolus Magnus, right? Now, if you remember back, one of the goals of the invading Germanic tribes was they wanted to be the Romans. They really looked at the Romans and were like, hey, these guys are great. But, of course, they had knocked the Romans out of the way to do this. And in knocking down the Roman structures, they kind of got rid of their ability to be the Romans. Well, this goal to become the Romans, if it ever comes to pass, it's going to come to pass in the form of Charles Martel's grandson, right, Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus, right, Charles the Great, if you want to translate it into English. So who is this guy, Charles the Great, right? Well, he's a Christian. He's a noted warrior and saw absolutely no conflict between the two of these. Charlemagne is going to inherit this Frankish kingdom, which is this most of France and part of Western Germany, but he's going to set out to expand these holdings and also to convert people to Christianity. So he saw this as not only a dynastic expansionist mission, but also a sort of a holy one as well. Throughout the course of his life, he's going to lead 54 military campaigns. So he was a serious warrior, he was a serious general. He's going to be conquering northeastern Spain, the Brittany Peninsula in what is now France, Saxony, and in western Germany. And northern Italy, actually, he's going to go all the way down to Rome. So this is him in Charlemagne, where this is a much later pictorial depiction of him, where you've got the German eagle and you've got the French fleur de lis. And there he is with his sword in one hand and the Christian cross in the other. And this, I think, it gives you a pretty good little window into Charlemagne there as well. This is a map, gives you an idea of kind of where he expands out to. He starts out in the orange and then he starts expanding outward into the other places for his military expansionism, right? He has himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800. There's a little bit of controversy about who exactly was behind the crowning, whether it was the Pope instigating it or whether it was Charlemagne himself. One of the problems, of course, that Charlemagne has is he's got this massive, imperial area, and you're only got, late 8th, early 9th century levels of communication technology. And so how do you get everybody all on the same page? How do you get them doing what you want them to do from the central government? Because you don't exist at a point where you can sort of hop on a satellite phone and just tell them immediately. So you have to find a way to overcome this natural regression towards localism when you're trying to set up a central government. And in this case, he's going to use lands, right? Land is the carrot. You want to get the local lords to follow your rule. And so if you do what I say and you continue to show loyalty towards me, politically, governmentally, economically, then you get these lands and in return for lifetime service, right? He wants to restore power and land to the church, but this is to get ecclesiastical backing for what he wants to do, right? But you still have this very anti-centric nature of the Frankish culture. We've talked about this before, and so the kingdom is pretty largely inefficient, although impressive in overall size. It never becomes this sort of mega imperial state like the Romans had. And so you've got a few different kind of windows into this crowning of him as Holy Roman Emperor. And in this one, it looks like Charlemagne really kind of has the power in the situation. He's got his sword, he's very defiant, all right, Pope, crown me, right? And this comes from some of the documentation that says that, this is really Charlemagne's thing, and the Pope just doesn't have much of a choice, but he has to recognize Charlemagne's suzerainty over all of Central Europe. But then you look at this one that's done a little bit later, and there's Charlemagne, and he's much more penitent, right? He's bowing down in front of the Pope. Oh, Pope. The Pope's like, here, here's your little hat, right? Have a good time, right? So this, of course, is based on the divergence of this. No, the Pope is very much the guy who's in charge of this. He's establishing spiritual dominion over a political kingdom. And so just to put that out there for you guys to think about as you try to understand the political interplay between different empires around the world and religious institutions, right? So when we talk about changes in society during the Carolingian period, one of the major cultural factors, of course, is the church, right? And they have reached this point where they're preaching the idea that you should really abstain from sexual intercourse. However, if you just can't hold it, you ought to get married and have a family. So one of the other sides of this is they oppose any form of contraception. This is the Roman Catholic Church, still like this today, right? So what that means is you guys should get married and know you really shouldn't do anything to try to prevent conception of children. You're going to have a lot of kids, right? This goes hand in hand with a lot of Frankish cultural institutions anyway, where they value the family, the larger the better, right? And you're also going to see that less children are intentionally killed, right? Exposed to the elements, as in Roman days, because due to the inherent agrarian nature of a lot of these Frankish cultures, this is going to be create a demand for children as an economic production unit. Labor, right? We're also going to see that diets are beginning to improve with better harvests. So you put all these factors together and you're going to have an expanding population, right? You got a whole bunch of other set of Frankish cultural customs, and one of these I threw on here is Charlemagne stresses this idea of hospitality for travelers. So you'd have all these little cultural markers that would be in here as well. Well, Charlemagne, like all great human beings throughout history, eventually he assumes room temperature, right? He is going to die. And true to the Frankish custom that you often see is, well, to keep the sons from kind of bickering or fighting or having a civil war, is you divide up the empire. So this process here of consolidation, breakup, reconsolidation in slightly different format continues, right? So in this case, Charlemagne is going to die, and his empire is going to go to his three sons, right? Karl, he's going to get the west, which would later be more or less analogous with France. Lothar, there's a cool name. For those of you who haven't had kids yet and are thinking, what would be a good name for a kid? Lothar, something to think about, right? Lothar is going to get Belgium, West Germany, and northern Italy, sort of the middle slice. And then Louis is going to get the east, which for the most part is, which we would know as Germany. Right? So this is what's going to take place. So you have these three kingdoms here. You can see the west, kind of the central part, and then the eastern section. So it consolidates, and Charlemagne has this great empire, and then it's basically as soon as he's gone, it shatters, right? But what we're going to see as an outgrowth of this is a real solidification of what is often referred to as the feudal system, right? Now remember, a feud is a fight. So if you want to think of the feudal system as the fighting system, that's not terribly wrong. Now there's a way it's supposed to work, and then there's the way that it actually works, right? Now, the reason that Charlemagne feels that he has to do this, and of course he doesn't invent this out of whole cloth. This is something that partially at least dates all the way back to the Roman Empire. But it really begins to solidify itself pretty strongly under Charlemagne's tutelage, and then it was moving in that direction in kind of European and also really in world history. You can find it in Japan, you can find it in a lot of other places as well. So this is the problem that you've got to have for central government of a very decentralized state, right? And it's going to become the dominant form of basically all government institutions in Europe. Now it's a hierarchical system. You got levels, all right? You got rungs on the ladder. And what you have is the benefits travel down. You give the people below you benefits. And then they, in turn, pay you with duty. There's something they have to do for you to go up the social scale, right? But this wasn't a fixed system, right? The power players were constantly changing. If you could kill the people above you, there's a chance that you could move up, right? If you ally yourself with somebody else and you knock out the person ahead of you. So what that meant was, when you have changing political realities, you have changing opportunities on this political scale, which is going to lead to a lot of fighting. Feudal system, right? For example, kings have very little of the power that they're going to later wield. When you think of the king as just this guy who walks in and he just tells everybody what to do and he's just a dictator on earth, not quite. Kings have a lot of power, but they don't have the sort of absolute power that they're going to have in later centuries. Now, technically speaking, at the top you have the monarch, below him you have kind of the upper nobility, and then you have the lesser nobility, but mixed into this layer is also members of the church. The church was considered just as much a part of the leadership of a nation as anything else. Below them you have kind of the knights and the local lords, kind of these guys that are the local government, and then of course the bottom is the peasants and the serfs, which makes up the overwhelming bulk of the population. Anyway, so you get a little chart. You have the king, upper nobles, lesser nobles, and then slobs like you and me, right? So the way that this would work is kings offer land and titles for the counts, the dukes, the barons, etc., right? Depending on what size of a chunk of property that you got, right? Now, these nobles, in many cases, their chunks of property were a little too large to efficiently manage personally, and so they would then sub-in feud, or they would, just chunk it up into smaller pieces, and they would give it out to the local lords, the knights, etc. Right? And so the local lords then managed their populations of serfs and or townspeople, depending on what they had within their sphere, right? And they provided the land, the food, the organization, the government, and most of all, protection. There's a reason that these people went along with this as well. So this gives you an idea, right? On the way down, you got land and protection down the social scale, and then loyalty and military support on the other side of the scale as well. So when we start at the bottom, the peasants provide the labor, agricultural product, and then any other industrial product that they can, and thus they're going to generate wealth for the local lords and knights. The knights, especially, they've got to buy their equipment, they've got to pay to train a retinue of soldiers in order to protect the local people from marauders, enemy armies, things like that, right? And so the knights also, they're going to be the military coterie for the dukes, the barons, the counts, etc., right? So when there's a military engagement impending, the upper nobility are going to get in touch with these guys and say, hey, bring your column of soldiers, your knights on horseback, your archers, your foot soldiers, etc., and we're going to meet, we're going to form an army, right? But also they were expected to provide loyalty in these political moments. You're going to go to these meetings and say, hey, this is my guy and I support him, right? You were expected to do that. The greater nobles are the ones that are going to be able to gather armies. They're also going to be the ones that are going to be able to gather enough cash in order to loan money or give money or do whatever they can to buy things for the kings. Now the church is leavened throughout this because it has an actual functioning network, right? You have a religious network for the people. They're bringing in money in terms of tithes. They're distributing money out on a system. They are in communication with each other through the network of writing to each other. And of course, they have a central organization with the Pope in Rome. And more importantly, they provide religious backing. You have the social side of, well, God wants us to do this, right? Well, there are going to be some other problems that begin to hit this area as well, and a lot of this is going to start really in Central Asia. There'll be one, kind of exception to this, but there are a number of expansions that are going to take place as a result of this. Well, Islamic forces that had really viewed Europe as kind of enemy territory, they invade here in France, right? After taking over most of the Iberian Peninsula, and they get stopped at the Battle of Tours. So land invasion-wise, they're not able to move into most of continental Europe, but these assaults on Europe are going to continue via the seas. And so you'll see that a lot of southern Europe, a lot of these islands in the Mediterranean are going to change hands between the Muslim empires of North Africa, right, and the Christian forces in Europe. The island of Sicily is a good example of this. And so this is also the period where you'll see a great deal of Islamic activity on the high seas. This is the period where the Sinbad the Sailor stories kind of come from as they're beginning to spread Islam throughout much of the world via oceanic exploration rather than just land conquest from their military. Another group here, the Mujars, right? They're going to be moving into this area from Central Asia. They're a pretty typical, horseback raiding culture. They're not terribly different than any of these other groups of people that we've talked about before. And they're going to run wild because they, can outstrip most of these civilizations' ability to organize a defense against them. But eventually, they do get kind of defeated and pushed backwards, and they will settle in Hungary, right? The Vikings, though, are going to be proving a much more lasting problem for a lot of these people. They're from Norway and Sweden and Denmark and some of these other, kind of Nordic countries in the Baltic and North Sea kind of area. And they're also going to be the ones that not only will they provide these people with, in Europe, a lot of problems, but some significant social changes as well. So I got a couple scenes of this, right? You got the Mujars, they're riding in, they're pretty wild, out of control. This is not what the scene that you would want to wake up to early morning in medieval Europe. The Mujars are, riding you down. But they eventually would be corralled and start moving backward into what is now Hungary. Here's some scenes of the Islamic sailors, right? There's Sinbad the Sailor. He's going on these epic sort of voyages, taking over islands in the Pacific or in the Mediterranean, moving outward in various other places. And so this is the period when that is going on. So you can see the map here gives you an idea of kind of where some of these Muslim sea invasions of the 9th century especially were beginning to take place. So all of these places are going to be feeling this pretty heavily. But the one that we want to talk in most detail about are the Vikings, right? These are the North sailors of the 9th and 10th centuries. Those are the kind of the 2 centuries when they had their heaviest activity. Now, we remember them as being these ridiculously warlike people, right? But that's because, for the most part, we only have written documents from the point of view of the people getting attacked by Vikings, right? They don't go and see what these Norse settlements look like on kind of a day-to-day basis. So their assumption is, well, these Vikings are just these crazy, warriors that come out of the water and attack you and that's all that they do because that's all we see them doing, right? But actually, we're going to see that the Vikings contributed a number of settlements throughout Europe. They're going to branch out of Scandinavia, these narrow kind of fjords in Norway. Once they, like a lot of raiding cultures, once they kind of expand their population past the ability of their local environment to supply them, they start branching out and attacking other settlements. Now, most of the other ones would be like the Magyars or the Mongols and a bunch of these other people. They're mostly on land. The Vikings are different in the fact that they have a similar culture, but they're on the water, so it's boats instead of horses, right? And so these guys are going to start branching out all over the place, and they had these raiding adventures, and they're attacking these seaside settlements from Iceland all the way into the Mediterranean. They also use the big river systems, and they're very versatile longboats in order to travel up the rivers into real deep territory of the European continent. When I show you the map, you're going to have a tough time believing it's like, they made it all the way into there? Yes, they did. They, according to most accounts, people think that they even reached what is now eastern Canada, right? Now, they spread fear pretty quickly, which is what raiding cultures want. You want to be able to drive people out of the way, go in, take their stuff, and get out of there as quickly as possible, right? But eventually what you're going to see is they become such a persistent problem that many of these local lords and dukes and things like that, they get with some of these Vikings and they say, hey, look, we'll give you land if you'll stay in our area and protect us from future Viking raids. And so what's going to happen is they're going to transform some of these areas into parts of England, parts of France, some of these other places, right? Little kind of Viking settlement areas, right? And they become then the buffers against future Viking raids, and they would then assimilate into these cultures, and they're going to convert over, for example, from paganism to Christianity with this. And so this is the typical view of the Vikings. They're coming at you. They're the berserkers, that kind of thing. But, of course, they had a whole culture in Norway. There you can see one of their little coastal villages, a protected harbor, right? And this is the inside of sort of a Viking home, what it would look like. So they had their whole culture out there. This is, of course, the Thor's hammer. This is Mjolnir that has been converted over, more or less, to a Christian crucifix. So this is a post-Christian conversion of the Vikings to Christianity, right? So the map gives you an idea of kind of where these guys are going out. Okay, they're raiding the North Sea, they're raiding England, they're raiding Ireland, northern France. Wow, they're really going out there. Man, they're going into the Mediterranean. Wow, they're going into central Russia on a lot of these long, deep raids into the river systems of central Russia. And yeah, they are. They're going to be pretty impressive in terms of where they wind up, right? So we talked about feudalism and how it was supposed to work, right? But this is how it actually started working, right? This is what it turned into, right? The real feudal system of the Middle Ages was completely based on local power because they had to have the money, they had to have the resources, and you couldn't be everywhere to keep an eye on everything, right? And we're going to see that the central governments often broke down. Sometimes it was because, like after Charlemagne, they intentionally break it up, or in many cases it's because you've got political infighting, nobody can assert full control, so you constantly have this back and forth push between local governments and, well, I was supposed to get the throne, no, I'm supposed to have this throne. So you have all those kind of scenarios. So what happens is it leaves these local nobles often as the de facto rulers in most of these areas. So these nobility, they gave the land grants to the knights for income, right? The knights could buy equipment and they have the time to train, right? And the knights would turn into what they would call the vassals, right? This is a specific term which means a military servant of oath. And so the idea of oath-taking, where you have these oath ceremonies, very important to these people. Now, that doesn't always mean that you hold your oath, right? But if you were going to break it, you had to take it very seriously. And so you have some kind of political opportunity, or you feel somebody's stabbed you in the back or whatever, right? So the local lords and knights, generally speaking, they didn't wind up with a title to the land. But over the course of time, after many of these vassalages become multi-generational, just the assumption is, well, this is my family's land, even though technically it's the people above you, right? Because the lords and the knights are going to provide the land and the cash in exchange for loyalty and soldiers, right? So this is how this is going to go, right? So all right, what's the knight? What's the deal with him? We've talked throughout much of World History 1 here about the important relationship between what happens on the battlefield and what happens in society, especially politically, right? When the nobility and when these people, well, we're the ones who win the battles, well, they get the power, And then when you'll see, for example, with the advent of the Greek hoplites, we don't think you guys should have the power. We can win battles by ourselves, right? And so there's this constant kind of back and forth of who is winning the battles, literally, for your society. They get the political power, right? And so throughout much of the Roman period, warfare was dominated by the foot soldier. The infantry really kind of dominated what was going to happen on the battlefield. Ever increasingly, we're seeing, though, that the heavy horse, especially, is coming to dominate these battlefields, right? And so this is just one of those changes in warfare technology, techniques, what's available, who is it that's doing this. And so that is going to shift this now back towards the horseback warrior, right? So knights, they've got to train, right? You've got to have a special horse, you've got to have a courser, right? You've got a charger. And of course, you've got to have this time to train, to get the equipment, to recruit soldiers. So the fief castle becomes the center of local government and economy. You'll have some big ones, you'll have some small ones, but you're going to want to see that the local people, they want to be fairly close to the castle because it's a military structure that can offer protection, right? And so, like I said, the fiefs are not technically possessions, right? But they're only supposed to be provided for their use. Basically, the upper nobility saying, hey, knight so-and-so, you can use this land and its produce and its people in order to create this military force that we're going to need, right? However, as we're going to see over the course of time, they become more or less assumed to be hereditary anyway, right? And so the knights, or the local lords or whoever, right, they become the government of their area. They held all the reins of political power. They're the judge whenever there's a court case over who stole whose pig, right, or who owed whose money. They're the mayor. They're the ones that set the rules in the village, right? And they're the town councils, all in one. They say, okay, this is what we're going to be doing this week, right? Now, the relationship with their superiors was supposed to be permanent, but as we can probably intuit, changing political realities, the opportunity to pick up more land or territory, or they feel the guy ahead of them has really screwed them out of what they were owed, right? This is going to lead to a great deal of fighting, and in many cases they're going to fight amongst each other, they're going to fight, in some cases, people above and or below them, right? So that's what's going to take place. And as I've shown you before, nothing explains warfare quite like plastic soldiers, right? So there's these guys, the knight charge. This is what's going to determine who's going to win the battle. These guys with great big horses are charging, their lances come down right at the last second, and then they either ride through the enemy, make a giant hole, or they don't. But the onus of battle is on them. So you can see some of these fief castles. This is one on a hill, and you can see the villages splayed out below it, very, very near it. And of course, this is another one where you have the fief castle on the side of a kind of a mountain, and then the houses for the people are just below it. You wanted to stay close to that as much as you could, right? So when we talk about when you get to the 900s or so, what are some of the political changes that are beginning to take place, right? You have the breakup of the Carolingian Empire, and the kings are really losing some power, right? They're losing their kind of central authority. But ever increasingly, we're seeing that the nobility in the 10th century are starting to choose a little bit more active central government, right? You'll see that, for example, in France, the Capet family, the Capetians, they become the kings of much of France. Otto I is going to link Germany and Italy together to try to resurrect this Holy Roman Empire that had existed under Charlemagne. Alfred the Great, who is sometimes by a lot of historians referred to as the first kind of real king of England, right? He's going to drive out these Danish forces, and he's going to unify the Anglo-Saxon people in England under one political leadership. So we're seeing some consolidation that's beginning to take place. So while they become kings, and they're becoming kings over what you and I would recognize, especially kind of later on, as the actual nation state, their subordinates cooperated really when it was only in their interest, and so there's a lot of struggle back and forth between local government versus national government. And so here you can see a bunch. This is Alfred the Great here in England, right? And then this is this big sort of, the hand of God coming down for Otto I, the Holy Roman Empire, and stuff like that. And then this is Hugh Capet, right, of the Capetian family. Interestingly enough, the only European monarch that we had who was shaped like a bowling ball pin. So, just anyway, some fun stuff there for us to think about, right? Okay, so what about there's a lot of political stuff to think about and digest, and this is the whole system, but what about normal people? What are they doing? The manor system really is what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, because the manor system is the dominant economic system for the Middle Ages. This is what these people are doing on a day-to-day basis. The peasants, the people who don't have land, the people who have to work for somebody else, or they have to rent land or something like that, in many cases, especially early in the period, they become serfs. Serfs are sort of like slaves. Right? And you say, well, how would this happen? In many cases, it was in order to obtain protection, right? There's pretty violent, volatile times. hey, I'll work for you, you can tell me to do whatever, as long as I'm secure and I don't have to go anywhere, right? So serfs are slaves, but we as Americans we sort of have a colored, tinge on what slavery is and what isn't. We have one narrow kind of focus of what that is, and this is a somewhat different, flavor of it, right? Now, these guys, they are bound to the land. They can't get up and leave, and they can't go anywhere else, and they have to do whatever the Lord tells them to do. However, they can't be bought and sold, and they can't be moved around. So that's the trade-off, right? So serfs were expected to work 3 days a week for the Lord. They had to harvest his crops, they had to sell his stuff, they had to make his grain, they had to shoot his horses, dig rocks out of his field, whatever, okay? The rest of the week, they were allowed to work for themselves, right? Usually, and almost always, this is agriculture or the industries that are directly tied to local agriculture, right? Somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of the population are agricultural workers. And of course, they're using our crop rotation system and then a common field or pasture land for their animals. And they would rotate these throughout the various times of the year. They would then add, further rotations as they figured out, what could be planted over the top of other things, right? Now, all of these people are subject to the Lord's rule, right? But the Lords occasionally were the church, which owned a lot of manors and were given these as forms of income in order to purchase, essentially, political support for their activities. And this little diagram gives you an idea of how these would work. You have different fields, right? One is allowed to lie fallow, the animals eat on it, and then they go to the bathroom on it, right? So they're going to fertilize it, right? And then you got another field that's planted, another field that's planted with a different crop. You have a little village with a blacksmith and the mill, right? And then you've got these people with their houses. You have the local church. You have the manor house where the Lord is going to stay most of the time. And then, of course, off the screen, you have the fief castle where these guys are going to be doing their military stuff if necessary, right? And so you have these guys that are practicing their archery, the local soldiers, the peasants are out in the field working, and of course this guy, he's trying to chase his pig. So that gives you a pretty good idea of what we're talking about with the feudal system and the manorial system. And so this is these people's day-to-day lives in feudal Europe.